Good evening, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called Macduff Lives, and tonight it's Wednesday night, and that means we're doing our Wednesday night book review. The point of the Wednesday night book review is to keep the books on the book train in everybody's mind, because if you look at screamingospreys.com, which is my home website, you'll see a banner of books that is like pulled by an osprey, by the screaming osprey, and it goes across the page. And it used to be that each one of those books had maybe 15 or 20 or 30 different readings from me in it, going through most of the books so that you could get the entire history of this, whatever book it is. There you go, Andy. And good evening, Andy DeBala. Thanks for once again running all this wonderful technology for us. So that's the book train. Maybe let it go again, and we'll show you the raid on the book train. There you go. Let the old train leave the station, and she'll be going around the mountain and coming back in just a second. Well, The Raid by Benjamin Schemmer is one of the books that just astonished me when I started studying my father's career. And here comes the book train. Well, The Raid is on here somewhere. There it is. Okay. And right next to that is this book by none other than Admiral William H. McRaven called Spec Ops or Special Ops, which also features into my story tonight because McRaven wrote a book based upon his thesis at the military, I can't remember, the War College or the Military Academy. And in there, he cited the most important special op raids in all time. And one of the ones that he cites is the Sante raid. And he gives a fairly good description of the background and the raid and what happened in his book. So the idea of his book is, of course, to justify the idea that special ops is an important part of our military, and I think it is. But in order to do that, he's using as an example this particular operation called the raid on Sante prison as an example of success. And that is the interesting question about the Sante raid, is how can you call it a success when they came home with no prisoners? The amount of work and preparation that went into that raid in November of 1970 was far out of proportion compared to the results, unless you stretch it out into a political result and to say, well, what we did was we proved that we could do this. We proved that we could penetrate deep into North Vietnam and run a very complicated raid and rescue prisoners, but for the fact that unfortunately the prisoners had been moved. If it weren't for that, then the raid would have been successful. And that's true. But it wasn't successful, and yet after action report written by the leader of the raid, General Leroy Manor, was all glowing and saying we proved that we could do this, and the North Vietnamese were forced to give the prisoners better conditions because we showed that we could do it. And that's the thesis of the analysis that says that it was in fact successful. So, I'm not going to argue whether it was or was not successful, except for to point out that this raid is being cited as one of the most important and successful special ops operations in history. And when I found this book, I saw the word Saxa in it, and I said, "Oh wow, I've got to get this book," because, as you know, my dad worked for Saxa. So what I think I'll do is I'll turn to the book. Here's the cover of it, The Raid by Benjamin Schemmer. I guess before I do that, I'll make a note that Mr. Schemmer was a high-level analyst at the Department of Defense. He worked for Robert McNamara back when all this stuff was going on, and he is one of the great experts on the Air Force and special operations. So he was there, and he certainly has the competence, the expertise, and the right to have written this book. But as he was writing it, he was also suffering from a terrible disease. I can't remember which it was, but he persevered with the help of his wife to get this book written. And that kind of perseverance is what we need to tell the truth. And that's why he wrote it, to tell the truth about the Sante raid in 1970. So, excuse me, I have to wear glasses for this. It's a little bit small print. So here's where I think I'll begin tonight on page 34 of the book, SACSA, S-A-C-S-A. Not many of the 27,840 people who worked at the Pentagon in 1970 knew what the acronym SACSA meant. Fewer still had any inkling of what the group really did. It was headquartered in the prestigious E Ring, just beneath the office of the Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. 5 United States Capitol buildings could rest comfortably within the Pentagon's walls, and 2.5 Washington monuments could be stretched end to end across the same space. So proximity to the E Ring executives was an important indication of where an individual or office stood in the military hierarchy's pecking order. SACSA stood pretty close to the top. So the E Ring is the outside ring. So if you look at the river entrance of the Pentagon, right there next to the entrance, on the lowest floor was my dad's office. And one of the other things that tells you that he was important was he had a window, because most people that worked in the Pentagon then, you know, they didn't have windows. That was just these caves of concrete that went on endlessly around the Pentagon sides. So to have a window and to be on the E-wing, but also to be on the river entrance, which is the ceremonial important entrance to the Pentagon, right directly below the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And then the Joint Chiefs of Staff is directly below the Secretary of Defense. So all three, that's a vertical line from SecDef to JCS to SACSA in 1970. And that's where my dad was working as the counterinsurgency planner. So this is why I find this to be so important to my dad's story, is that he is the guy that had to sign off on the raid. It couldn't have gone forward without him saying, okay, it's set, it's ready, let's go. SACSA, the name of the officer that was the SACSA at the time, was Donald D. Blackburn, a sandy-haired, 6-foot, 180-pound Army Brigadier General, the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities to the Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. He looked far younger than his 53 years, and after greeting Allen, Kohler, Iles, and Watkins that Monday morning, he picked up the telephone to ask a fifth man to join them down the hall. This was Army Colonel Ed Meyer, a tall, stocky, North Dakota-born clandestine operator who looked like an affable, mild-mannered Midwestern farmer, but one whose patience should not be tested unnecessarily. There was something in him, in his bearing, that hinted he could break the average man in two with a sudden whack of his forearm. Meyer headed a small group in SACSA called the Special Operations Division. His work never made the newspapers. For one thing, it took far more than a top secret or Q clearance to find out what special operations did. Another personal note, I have a card, a sympathy card that was attached to some flowers sent to my father's funeral, and it was signed the guys at Special Operations Division. So he knew them, and they knew him. Pardon me. But see, a lot of this is me making the claim that my father was the chief planner for the Sante raid, despite the fact not in this book, not in McCraven's book, not in any other book I've ever seen is his name even mentioned. And so maybe you might think that's a tough row for you to hoe, John, but it's not, because we know that they buried his name. They wanted him not to be known to history. And as you see, this Colonel Meyer had the same idea. His work never made the newspapers. The five men sat down at a conference table, and then Allen and Watkins and asked Iles to go through the briefing they'd prepared, showing how the 1127th had positively identified prison compounds at both Aplo and Sante, and how they had pieced together the urgent request to rescue prisoners held at Sante. The briefing over, Allen told the group that he thought the men could be rescued. He wanted to know if Blackburn could arrange for a clandestine agent to be put in the area. Contrary to many impressions, agents in most of North Vietnam were a military responsibility, not the CIA's, and their missions were laid on and controlled by SACSA. Early in the 60s, President Lyndon Johnson had limited the CIA's coverage to the western part of North Vietnam, within 15 miles of the Laotian border. The CIA had a number of operating sites there, and some coverage into North Vietnam was a natural fallout, but organizing the rescue would be largely the responsibility of SACSA. I want to go back to the beginning because I think it's a pretty cool story. Now, just to place myself in this again, inserting myself into the story, I think is fair in this circumstance, because it was in September of 1970 that my mom and dad drove me down to Williamsburg, Virginia, and dropped me off to go to college at William & Mary. And basically, once I was out of the car, they pulled away, and that was the last time I ever had a serious visit with my dad or had a chance to talk to him about anything, because I was, of course, a student, and he went back home to the Pentagon and was intensely busy for the rest of his fall preparing, I believe, this exact Sante prison raid. Eight days before Thanksgiving of 1970, President Richard M. Nixon met in the White House Oval Office with four of his closest advisors to hear one of the most dramatic briefings of his presidency. It was Wednesday morning, November 18th, a cold and cloudy day, so bleak in Washington that the National Weather Service would record only 0.4 of an hour of sunshine all day long. Nixon was deep in conversation with National Security Advisor Henry A. Kissinger, Central Intelligence Agency Director Richard M. Helms, Defense Secretary Melvin Laird, and Secretary of State William P. Rogers, when Admiral Thomas H. Moorer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was ushered in precisely at 11 a.m. The tall, soft-spoken Moorer greeted the president, nodded to the other men with a warm yet businesslike smile, and opened a large map case full of 20 by 30-inch briefing charts. As he set them up on an easel between the president's desk and the overstuffed chairs and sofas which flanked the Oval Office fireplace, Rogers noticed the top secret designation on the chart's cover sheet. Of all those present, he was the only one for whom the subject of Moorer's briefing would be a total surprise. The United States Secretary of State was about to learn for the first time that a, quote, invasion of North Vietnam had been planned for months. Nixon laid his ever-present yellow legal pad on an end table beside his chair, a sign for Moorer to proceed. Moorer opened his briefing book, a carefully tabbed three-ring black binder with the words "Top Secret, Chairman's Eyes Only" stamped in gold on the cover. "Mr. President," he began, "the code name for this operation is Kingpin. It provides for a raid on North Vietnam to be conducted by Army Special Forces personnel assaulting the Son Tay prisoner of war camp, 23 miles west of Hanoi, in Air Force helicopters, assisted by a Navy air diversion near Haiphong. The most advantageous period for this undertaking is between November 21st and 25th, 1970. Standing beside the easel, Moorer uncovered a large map of North Vietnam to pinpoint the location of the Son Tay compound. He calmly described the compound's layout and said, "This is the only confirmed active POW camp outside Hanoi, Mr. President. The Son Tay camp has a prisoner population of 70 Americans. Of these, 61 have been tentatively identified by name and service: 43 Air Force, 14 Navy, 4 Marines. We propose," Moorer said, "to rescue them all." As Moorer began to describe how the rescue mission would be timed and executed, Kissinger quietly picked up a phone. Within minutes, his deputy, Major General Alexander M. Haig, entered the Oval Office and took the chair farthest from Moorer's briefing charts. Flipping through the charts one by one, Moorer took 18 minutes to relate the details of the raid. Despite the Pentagonese in which the briefing was written, his proposal was full of drama, rich in detail. He knew the subject well and referred only sporadically to his briefing book. Finally, Moorer paused. He had a flair for dramatic effect. Then he spoke very slowly. "The ground commander is positive that the operation will succeed, Mr. President." The president, one participant at the briefing would recall, was lapping it up, quote, like an 8-year-old at his first cowboy movie. He told Moorer, "Sounds great, Tom. What else?" Moorer gave a short, intelligent summary which focused on the threats that would be present, that would present the operation with its greatest risks. Then he paused again. "A final word, Mr. President. If resources in support of this operation reveal that the enemy may have determined our objective, the operation will be canceled." He let the word "canceled" sink in. "Damn, Tom, let's not let that happen," Nixon said. "I want this to go." During the briefing, Moorer realized the president had scribbled only a few notes on the legal pad at his side. That was good, Moorer thought. He'd kept the president's attention, and there wouldn't be many questions. Nixon had only 2. He asked when Moorer had to have a final decision. Then he asked what cover stories had been devised in case the raid failed. The raid on Son Tay had been postponed once before for political reasons. But now, Nixon said, how could anyone not approve this? Then he told Moorer, "Tom, I know you guys have worked months on this. I want these POWs home too. Hell, if this works, we could even have them here for Thanksgiving dinner, right here at the White House." And let's put an asterisk over the sentence that Benjamin Schemmer says. The raid on Son Tay had been postponed once before for political reasons. Political reasons, meaning Henry Kissinger. And this is the key to what I think is the real reason that it didn't succeed, was because Henry Kissinger postponed the raid for a month. It was supposed to go in October. Well, that's a little simplistic. Of course, there was also other reasons to suspect that Kissinger knew that the prisoners had been moved before October, in fact, as early as July, but kept that to himself and let the raid preparations go ahead, even though Kissinger had information that if the Saxa people had known, might have very much changed their ideas of going on this raid in the first place. Pardon me. Next, I'll read a little extract from chapter 2. And this part of it starts at one of George Webb's favorite places in the world, Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Fort Belvoir, of course, 15 miles south from the White House on the Potomac River, just south of Mount Vernon. So here is the scene to picture in your mind as I read this. Air Force Technical Sergeant Norval Kleinbell and his bosses were sure he had made a breakthrough. They were working their usual Saturday morning stint in the heavily secured, isolated compound that housed the Air Force's 1127th Field Activities Group at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Not many people knew what went on inside the high chain link fences that sealed the 1127th off from the Army Engineer Center in the northern part of the sprawling 9,000-acre post. A big 5 by 8 foot sign inside the gate said only 1127th USAF FAG. One of the unit's men used to complain about it. My Army friends kept asking me why we need such a big cage to hold the 1127th queer caught in the Air Force. The 1127th was, in fact, an oddball unit, a composite of special intelligence groups who, quote, conducted worldwide operations to collect intelligence from human sources. The men of the 1127th were, quote, con artists, unquote. Their job was to get people to talk. Russian defectors, North Vietnamese soldiers taken prisoner in South Vietnam, anyone who might have information and was willing to sing. In addition, the 1127th processed intelligence on American prisoners of war and designed programs to help downed airmen evade capture or escape from prison. The latter work went on in a small section called the Evasion and Escape Branch. 2 of its members had been prisoners themselves. Personnel assigned to the branch were dedicated to their work, good at it, and frustrated by it. They knew there were more than 462 American POWs in Southeast Asia. 80% of them held captive in North Vietnam. Over half of the POWs had been imprisoned for over 2,000 days, longer than any serviceman had ever spent in captivity in any war in America's history. Some, they knew, had died. Others were near death, and all the POWs were being held in conditions so primitive and brutal that they sometimes wondered if any of them would return home sane. The date was Saturday, May 9th, 1970. 12 days before, President Nixon had launched the invasion of Cambodia. It was not going well. About all the White House could announce was the discovery of 65 tons of rice in the fishhook area of South Vietnam Cambodian border. Earlier that week, 4 students at Kent State University had been shot to death by National Guardsmen called out to control a campus protest against the war. 11 others had been wounded. The day before, 75,000 protesters had demonstrated at the White House, which the Secret Service decided to seal off by a bumper-to-bumper ring of buses borrowed from the D.C. Transit Company. Early that Saturday morning, a sleepless president drove to the Lincoln Memorial to mingle with the protesters, mostly college students. Then the war. Mostly college students in a gloomy, drizzling rain. He talked with them about football, then the war. Their dialogue lasted about an hour. Later that day, 2 of Henry Kissinger's deputies mounted their own protest by resigning from the National Security Council staff. The invasion of Cambodia had torn America apart. About the only issue the country wasn't divided on was the POWs and MIAs. Everyone wanted them home. But there wasn't much prospect of that happening soon. In Paris, the North Vietnamese had made it clear that the prisoners were hostages. They would be released only when the United States pulled all of its forces out of Vietnam. President Nixon's withdrawal program was underway, but there were still 428,000 American servicemen in Southeast Asia. 920 of them would be dead before the month of May was over. 4,291 others wounded in action, about 20 taken prisoner, 25 more would be missing in action. Information on where those prisoners were held and where the missing might show up had the Pentagon's highest intelligence priority and became one of the nation's top 10 key intelligence questions. The intelligence community had gathered reams of input from a variety of sources, but useful, hard information was difficult to come by. One of the steps taken early in the war was to photograph regularly every installation in North Vietnam with a wall around it. That made a sizable target list, however, in a country where almost every family raised pigs and chickens and didn't want them running loose in the middle of a nation short on food, and where almost every school had its own closed-in compound. There were, of course, many sources of intelligence beside reconnaissance photographs, enemy propaganda films, news releases and broadcasts, and the interrogation of defectors and enemy prisoners of war, which had proved especially valuable when a captured North Vietnamese turned out to have a brother or a cousin or brother-in-law who was a guard in one of the POW camps. In one case, a previously unknown prisoner, Air Force Captain Willis E. Forby, had been positively identified when a North Vietnamese soldier taken captive in the South revealed that he had captured Forby when he was shot down early in the war, September 20th, 1965. Sometimes information came from foreign visitors to North Vietnam, or members of American protest movements allowed to visit there. Other tidbits were passed along, often purposefully gathered for the United States by military attachés and diplomats stationed in Hanoi from friendly and neutral nations, and occasionally even from an unfriendly one. Another source was mail from the POWs themselves when they were allowed to write those cruelly short and uninformative letters home. Only about half the prisoners were being given that privilege, however. Finally, there were the 9 Air Force and Navy prisoners who had been released by North Vietnam after several months to several years of captivity. But that was a rare occurrence, and in mid-1970, almost a year had passed since the last 3 came home. Apprentice Seaman Douglas Hegdahl, Navy Lieutenant Robert Frischman, and Air Force First Lieutenant Wesley L. Rumble had been released. Late in 1966, efforts had begun in earnest to exploit every such source of intelligence on a systematic basis. At that time, the Air Force alone had 264 men down in North Vietnam, but only 29 of them were known to be POWs, including one man shot down over the South China Sea, who was being held prisoner in China. The other 235 were missing in action. North Vietnam announced very few captures. It had been evident that Vietnam was going to be a repeat of Korea, with the enemy refusing to make systematic reports on the identity, location, and treatment of the American prisoners, as required by the Geneva Accords, which, contrary to many impressions, North Vietnam had signed in 1959. I'm going to skip forward to page 29. At Fort Belvoir, a few men in the 1127th Field Activities Group devoted almost full time to unraveling the reams of raw data from the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA. Finally, on May 9, 1970, Norv Kleinbell was pretty sure he had discovered something hot on the POW camp west of Hanoi. He was an intelligence technical specialist, an old hand at the game, who had worked in Laos long before overt American operations began there. Just under 6 feet tall, slightly overweight, with receding blonde hair, close to retirement, Kleinbell was known for his patience, even when things didn't fit together right away. His work was like trying to cook a 3-star French dinner out of garbage, but he stuck to it. Late in April, he had started to assemble various tidbits of information, both old and new. There were 2 camps west of Hanoi. He was sure of it. And within a short time, he identified one of them. It was Ap Lo, 31 miles west of North Vietnam's capital. But a close comparison of old and new reconnaissance photos of the area revealed much more, Kleinbell thought. He went to his boss, Colonel George Iles, and asked him if he could bounce some ideas off him. Iles headed the 1127th's program division, of which evasion and escape branch were a part. He had more than an average interest in his work. He had been a POW himself in World War II, shot down over Italy in a P-51 Mustang. Together, Iles and Kleinbell laid out the bits and pieces, everything they knew, the total take from the intelligence community and their own latest, if small, collection of raw data. They came up with a almost simultaneous discovery. The jigsaw puzzle seemed to fit. If their analysis was correct, there were 2 POW camps west of Hanoi, the one at Ap Lo and another nearby in a walled compound just west of the provincial capital called Son Tay. Until Kleinbell compared the old and new reconnaissance photos of the area, no one had noticed that the Son Tay compound was being enlarged. There was a new wall and a new guard tower in the northwest corner. Through an ingenious code spelled out in hieroglyphics on the ground, someone in that camp had revealed that there were 55 prisoners at Son Tay. 6 of them were calling for an urgent rescue mission. They had devised a desperate plan that Iles and Kleinbell felt might just work if it was acted upon quickly. So from there, it goes up the chain of command to Saxa, and Saxa then puts together the plan. And the details of that plan are just astonishing in how everything had to be coordinated just exactly right. They went to Eglin Air Force Base in Florida to set up a mock of this prison camp and start doing their practice raids. And the person chosen to lead the raid was Air Force Brigadier General Leroy J. Manner. Here's a little bit of story from how he comes into the story as we start chapter 3, Ivory Coast. At Eglin Air Force Base, Brigadier General Leroy J. Manner was fishing on a Saturday morning when he got a phone call on his brick from his boss, General William W. Momyer, commander of Tactical Air Command, telling him, "You're needed in Washington Monday morning." Manner asked why. Momyer said he didn't know, and he probably didn't care. He was not an enthusiastic backer of special operations. In Vietnam, when commanding 7th Air Force, he had banned the Australian-style bush hats worn by his 14th Commando Wing and told its commander he was going to educate you guys back into the Air Force. He was to pack enough luggage to spend several weeks in Washington and fly up by special courier plane the next morning. Another plane picked up Colonel Bull Simons at Pope Air Force Base, North Carolina, near Fort Bragg, and flew him to Washington. Both had been told they would be met at Andrews Air Force Base, driven directly to the Pentagon, and briefed by Brigadier General Donald D. Blackburn, then the Joint Chiefs of Staff, SACSA. Manner and Blackburn had never met, but they knew of each other, and Manner had a good idea of what SACSA was all about. As commander of the Air Force's Special Operations Force at Eglin, the 49-year-old New York-born officer trained the unconventional warfare teams, which supported SOG operations in South Vietnam, in South Asia. His students included American and Vietnamese airmen, Cambodians, Thais, and occasionally a few Laotians. Their subjects covered everything from jungle defoliation and leaflet drops over North Vietnam to the clandestine insertion of special infiltration teams. Moreover, for 3 years, Manner had been at the Pentagon as the Air Force's top briefing officer on Southeast Asia. He knew there was a lot more to the war in Vietnam than the search and destroy sweeps, body counts, and fighter bomber missions which made up most newspaper accounts of the fighting there. Like Bull Simons, Manner had seen a lot of combat, 345 missions in World War II and Vietnam, 275 of them in Southeast Asia, where he commanded the 37th Tactical Fighter Wing at Phuket. Their reputations differed, however. In the Army, Bull Simons was respected as a combat leader, but he was a renegade whose work often made his superiors somewhat uneasy. In the Air Force, Leroy Manner was a precise organizer who quickly won the full confidence of his superiors. Simons was outspoken, Manner was quiet. Both were competent, dedicated, serious men, but they were different breeds of cat. So there you have the top team, General Manner, General Blackburn, and Bull Simons. And if you ever needed to do a rescue raid, I would certainly rely on people of their competence and their experience. Well, the story goes on, and it's very exciting as you see everything coming together, all the training. You'll learn in the book about the Special Santé Raider's knife that I believe my dad designed based upon his experience of using his Marine combat knife. When he was in the FBI, he had a big knife that he had gotten when he was in the Navy when they were in World War II, and he had a Marine combat knife. It was a great big Bowie knife. And the thing about that knife was that it had a slightly wider blade toward the end, that he had adapted that knife as a tool to open file cabinets and locked doors and things like that when he was in the FBI doing black bag operations. So he had this idea of using a knife as a very quick and efficient way to get things opened. And that's why they created this knife. And when George Webb was down at Fort Bragg the last time, he took a picture of that actual knife for me. So that, plus a number of other touches in the book, and the fact that my dad was the guy that was sitting at the desk that had to sign off on all this stuff, indicates to me that the absence of my dad's name in here is not important. What we do know is that he was the guy that would have put all this stuff together based upon his expertise as a planner from World War II all the way up until this time in 1970. Well, I want to thank Andy Dabala once again for engineering and producing tonight as we put together our presentation over the internet. Andy's up in Michigan and working very hard to make a success of the Belton Road Show, 12 to 2 every day at noon with George Webb every weekday from 12 to 2. Andy is working 10, 12, 14 hours a day, not only producing live, but also working behind the scenes in creating and preparing more content to help educate everyone, to try to make it interesting, to try to make this story something that you want to tune into, whether it's here on my show or on many of the other shows that we have now with Professor Hamamoto, with George, with Aaron Adler, and I hope one day we can entice Andy to have his own show. Well, so much I wanted to say, and again, an hour is just not enough to go over a very important book like this, and an extremely good read if you want one, The Raid by Benjamin Schemmer. There's other books on Sante, but I really think this is the one that I would rely on, and the dedication of the author is something that I take to heart as I do my work. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow. Good night.